Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Long Room Hub. You're very welcome. My name is Professor Vinnie Wade. I'm the Chair of Computer Science, but I'm also the Director of the ADAPT Research Centre, which focuses on digital content technologies. And it's cross-university and cross-disciplines within Trinity. And today, on behalf of the ADAPT Centre, I'm delighted to welcome you. Also, these series of talks which are focusing on aspects of ethics and of privacy in the internet today is also sponsored by the School of Education and the Confederal School of Religious Peace and Theology here in Trinity College. I have one or two just housekeeping announcements. Health and safety insist upon this, so in the interest of safety I will remind you that there's two exits, one there and one here. There is no aisle and there will be no oxygen masks dropped down in front of you. If in the case of fire, please use the staircases, don't use the lift. And for toilet, if anyone is needed, it's through the door here on the right hand side. So I just introduce Professor O'Neill to introduce the speaker today.
Vinnie, thank you. I'm going to stay seated and introduce from here. As Vinnie said, I'm O'Neill from law school, which is one of the co-hosts that wasn't mentioned in that long list of sponsors. It's all right. I have two very nice jobs today. The first is to introduce John, and then the second is to moderate the discussion afterwards. So don't all shout at once. I get to be in the happy position of being a fan, introducing an idol. I have been reading John's work for the last 20 years and I've been very heavily influenced by it. So those of you who know me, blame him. Two things. First, he is, like me, a graduate of UCC. We tend to stick together. And second, I first became aware of him when he was Professor of the Public Understanding of Technology in the Open University. And I've been reading his articles in the Observer and his books on technology and what it can do for us and what it can do to us, and not always necessarily good things, ever since. And I was absolutely thrilled when he accepted the ADAPT Centre invitation to come and speak to us today on the topic, you can't always get what you want. But I did. I got him to come along. Ladies and gentlemen, John Naughton. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for coming. I don't have any slides because I come from a world where people are PowerPointed out. And if I were the provost, I think I'd make use of PowerPoint as a sacrilege offence. But I'm not the provost. There's something seriously wrong with our public discourse about the internet. In fact, there are lots of things wrong with it. For a start, it's largely ahistorical, by which I mean that it's conducted in terms which suggest that the experiences we are having now are entirely unprecedented in human history. And I speak with feeling about this because, as some of you know, I write a weekly newspaper column about this stuff. And much of that time, what I'm tempted to do in my column is to escape from the sociology of the last 5 minutes, which appears to characterize much media commentary in this area. The obsession is always with what Michael Lewis once called the new thing. Has Apple peaked? What will those mythical creatures called teens do next? Will Snapchat displace Facebook? And so on ad infinitum. Now, personally, I couldn't give a monkey's whether Apple has peaked. And I don't care whether Snapchat will replace Facebook or not, because in 100 years' time, only cyber archaeologists will know what Facebook was. And people will wonder what that blip was in the evolution of the internet between 1993 and 2033. And then some smart graduate student will say, hey, maybe that was the web. But this idea cuts no ice with the hard-faced news editors of our media. And when you say to them that if we want to understand the implications of a revolutionary transformation in humankind's information environment, then it might make sense to reflect on the only previous such revolutionary transformation, the one that was triggered by Johannes Gutenberg in 1455. And when you say that to them, they display all the panicky signs of men confronted by a lunatic, like, for example, checking for the nearest exit. And then there's the fact that our public discourse about this stuff, about the internet, is so Manichaean, which is a fancy way of saying that we constantly talk about the net as a struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, and we learn from utopian dreams to dystopian nightmares in the blink of an eye. And when I listen to these discussions, what comes to my mind is a scene in a pub in which two drunks are arguing energetically about whether oxygen is, on balance, a good or a bad thing. Because the fact is, whether we like it or not, the internet exists, is not going to be uninvented, and has effectively become part of our everyday lives. But the question from now on, for all of us, is not whether it's good or bad, but how we live with the new reality that it has brought. But most of all, what comes to mind when I survey public discourse about this stuff is the ancient fable of the blind man and the elephant. Now, you know the story, I'm sure. There are these guys who are blind, or as you say nowadays, visually challenged. There is an elephant, which, for a change, is not in the room, but in the open air. And the task of the blind man is to describe the elephant. Their method is a time-honored one. Each uses his hands or her hands to feel a different part of the beast. The guy who feels the trunk describes the elephant as a long, flexible muscle. The guy who gets the hind leg describes something heavy and solid and immovable like a tree, and so on. God knows what the guy who gets the tail thinks. The moral of the story, of course, is that no description of the whole elephant arises from this exercise. I think that our discourse about and our view of the internet are similarly patchy and disjointed, which is why I think it's worth trying to get a picture of the whole elephant, trying to get a picture of the internet as it is, rather than as we'd like it to be, or as we imagine that it is. This is maybe a bit ambitious, even hubristic, to imagine that one could do this in a single lecture, but I can at least make a start. As the Chinese say, even the longest journey begins with a single step. Where to start? Maybe the right place to begin is by accepting that while there have been communications networks since time immemorial, there's never been anything quite like the net. And the thing that makes it most exceptional is its disruptiveness. If you wanted a shorthand way of describing the internet in a sentence, you'd say this: it's a global machine for springing surprises. And the key to that capacity lies very deep in its architecture, in the two fundamental axioms that determined its design in the 1970s. The first of these axioms was that this internetwork, if that's what they called it at the beginning, should have no central ownership or control. The second was that the network should not be optimized for any particular application. This latter axiom led to the design of a system that did only one thing. It took in data packets at one end and did its best to deliver them to their destination at some other edge of the network. That's it. That's all it did. This principle was later dignified in a number of terms and phrases. Dumb network, smart applications was one I remember. The end-to-end principle was another. But whatever you call it, it had radical implications. It meant that if you had an idea for an application that could be realized using data packets, and if you had the talent and the skill to write the software to implement your idea, then the internet would accept your data packets with no questions asked and do its level best to deliver them to their destination. And because there was no central ownership or control, there was no need to say, hey, you can't do that, or to ask, who the hell do you think you are, messing about with this network. So what Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn and their colleagues had designed in the 70s was what Barbara von Scheeleck later described as an architecture for, quotes, permissionless innovation, unquotes. Note that phrase, permissionless innovation, because it's the key to understanding the disruptiveness and the distinctiveness of the internet. It's also the key to understanding why the network has triggered and continues to sustain an unprecedented explosion of creativity and innovation. Good, bad, and indifferent. It's what made the thing the global machine for springing surprises. What kinds of surprises? Well, here are a few of the obvious ones. The web, file sharing, malware, voice over IP, eBay, Wikipedia, Google, YouTube, Facebook. All of these came mostly from one or two individuals at most, who had vision and programming talent, and who almost all had little or no money. And of course, other surprises arrived, including malware, phishing, spam, and a host of other malodorous stuff. So what we have to recognize is that for the internet, disruption is, as we programmers say, a feature, not a bug, which is why it's much more important than any application that runs on it, and it's why I get so annoyed when I find government ministers confusing, thinking that the web is the internet, or worse still, that Facebook is the internet. Which is a delusion, by the way, shared by about 500 million of our fellow human beings. But describing the net only takes you so far. In order to understand it, you have to look at it through some kind of analytical lens. One such lens is provided by an old-fashioned academic discipline known as political economy. This is the field of thought from which modern economics evolved. But most modern economists would dearly like to disown their ancestry. Why? Because the comparison would reveal how impoverished their mathematically obsessed modern discipline has become. Political economy emerged as a distinct field of study in the mid-18th century, led by thinkers like Adam Smith and David Hume and Francois Fresnay, who began to look at the distribution of wealth and power in society, not in terms of the will of God or other deterministic explanations, but instead in terms of political, economic, technological, natural, and social forces and the interactions between them. So what does the political economy of the internet look like? Well, the first thing you notice is that it's dominated by a small number of very large companies. Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. Yes, Microsoft. It may look like an enfeebled giant that missed the vote on mobile, but it's still a very big and powerful company. And so one of the questions a political economist would ask is, what kinds of power do these huge companies wield? And how does that power differ? How does that power differ from that wielded by the huge industrial conglomerates of the past? Just taking Google as an example, we find that it is now suspected, with I think good evidence, of wielding old-style industrial muscle by exploiting its dominance of search to squeeze out competitors, which is the kind of thing that antitrust lawyers, and I hope there's some in the audience, know all about. But on the other hand, we have the so-called, quote, right to be forgotten, unquote, judgment of the European Court of Justice. But it actually confers not a right to be forgotten, but simply a right not to be found by Google search engine, because the complaint of material still exists on the web, still published. And what that means is that here we have a company which effectively has the power to determine who is visible and who is not in the network world. That's a very new kind of power, and it's not clear yet how we might conceptualize it. Then a political economist might ask, what are the business models of these great new enterprises? They vary, of course, from company to company. Apple makes beautiful, premium-priced gadgets and flogs them at huge margins to people like me with more money than sense. Amazon does many things, but in the end it all comes down to two: becoming the Walmart of the online world and being the dominant provider of cloud computing services. Microsoft continues to do its thing, which is essentially to be the dominant provider of computing infrastructure for governments and large organizations everywhere. Which leaves Google and Facebook, whose business model is essentially surveillance, in the sense that they provide free services that billions of people apparently value and appreciate, in return for the capacity and right to monetize and exploit, in other ways, the personal data of their users. Other things that our political economists would notice is the role of venture capital in this digital economy, together with the fact that in both the venture capitalists and the companies themselves, there are grotesque, and I mean the word, grotesque gender and ethnic imbalances. And our political economists would also observe that these fantastically profitable enterprises do not appear to be making much impact on the existential threat that faces all of our democracies, namely pervasive and increasing inequality. In fact, despite the bleating of Google and Facebook and their public affairs consultants, they and their industrial frog spawn like Uber look more and more like great engines of inequality, accumulating unconscionable wealth for their founders and their owners, while providing the technological basis for a new kind of economy, the concierge economy, in which billions of people with no job security provide services for elites who are, as the phrase goes, cash rich and time poor. And what of the state? Here, our political economists would notice some strange contradictions. On the one hand, the state provides the environment, the public services, the police, the legal systems, the schools, universities and other things on which these great enterprises depend for their safety and functioning. And yet the folks who built and run these companies appear to have overdosed on the neoliberal Kool-Aid. Many of them, and I know some of them, regard the state as essentially a nuisance which ought to be shrunk, and to which they should pay as little tax as compliant tax havens like Ireland will allow them to get away with. Standing here in Trinity, less than a mile from where Jonathan Smith once fulminated against hypocrisy, I wonder what the great Dean would have made of people whose vast wealth is entirely built on a network that was conceived and funded by taxpayers, despising the self-same state that provided the basis for their prosperity. That's not to say, though, that the state itself has been blameless in this new network environment. In the first place, we now know from Edward Snowden the extent to which nation-states have harnessed the technological affordances of internet and mobile technology to create a surveillance system that would make Orwell's eyes pop. Many years ago, in 1959, when President Dwight Eisenhower was preparing to vacate his high office, he made a final television address to the American people, in which he warned of the dangers to democracy posed by the rise of what he called the military-industrial complex, by which he meant the vast network of defense contractors, which is a polite word for arms manufacturers, that had fastened like a colony of leeches on the US Department of Defense in the formative years of the Cold War. What the Snowden revelations remind us is that over half a century later, that military-industrial complex has morphed into a military information complex, as the Booz Allen Hamiltons of this world sent rich pickings in the paranoia of a post-9/11 world. Another lens through which we might view the internet that we've got is provided by the history and philosophy of science, and in particular the view that technology is not autonomous in itself, but something that is socially constructed. This runs sharply counter to the prevailing Silicon Valley narrative, which is essentially one of technological determinism, the idea that technology drives history. If you go to Silicon Valley and you talk to these people, that's what they believe me. But if you take the idea of social construction seriously, then you see the evolution of the internet in a rather different light. Remember that this technology is now over 40 years old, and you can think of its history as a play in 4 acts. Act 1 was the ARPANET, the original packet switching network built by the US Department of Defense in the late 1960s. Act 2 in the internet story ran from 1973 to 1993. It opened in September 73 when design work on the network we use today, that's to say the one based on the TCP family of protocols, began. In January 1983, 10 years after the design started, the network was switched on, and the internet then ran as a research facility available only to a very elite group of scholars. So for the first 20 years of its existence, the internet was essentially the preserve of a technological elite. The computer scientists, engineers, graduate students and researchers who collaboratively designed and had access to it. It was also a totally non-commercial space. There were no corporations on the early internet. And this social context was critical in 2 ways. First, it shaped the way the technology itself evolved during the design phase, and it also shaped the way people thought about the technology. Early users of the network were drawn from a fairly tightly knit group of researchers, many of whom knew one another, and if they didn't, at least knew the other's institutional base. So for them, authentication, that is, establishing that the user was who she said she was not seen as important. And this indifference to authentication was hardwired, was baked into the SMTP protocol designed for handling email. This meant that an email server on the network did not check the provenance of messages as it passed them on. The implications of this omission did not really matter at the beginning, and it didn't become apparent until the network was opened up to millions and later billions of strangers, when it was one of the flaws in the architecture that facilitated the sending of spam and junk email. That's just one example of how the network was shaped by social factors. There are lots more, but we don't have time to go into them just now. Act 3 in the Internet story opens in 1993 with the launch of Mosaic, the first graphical web browser. This brought the Internet to the attention of the mainstream world. All of a sudden, non-geeks understood what this weird network was for. More importantly, the business world understood it too, as the biggest commercial opportunity in living memory. So you could say that what happened in Act 3 was essentially that Wall Street moved west and created the Internet we have today by mustering the economic resources which shaped its evolution. But it wasn't just greedy capitalists who shaped this network. We, the users, played a role too. As the World Wide Web brought the Internet into the mainstream of life, it turned out that most of us had a pathological objection to paying for anything online. But we still wanted all the wonderful things that were available online. And since there's no such thing as a free lunch, even in cyberspace, these goodies had to be paid for somehow. All those servers, all that bandwidth, all that air conditioning, all those sysadmins. And so a business model evolved. We could have all the goodies for free, but we paid for them by compromising our privacy and by allowing the companies to exploit and monetize our personal information in any way they could. So the Internet we got, that playing field so grotesquely tilted towards the companies and away from us, was our creation too. And that's worrying in more ways than one. Because what we've also discovered in the last few years is that in a strange way the Internet serves as a mirror in which we see a reflection of human nature. And some of what we see is deeply, deeply troubling. We see, for example, appalling levels of hatred, of prejudice, of sexism, of misogyny, of ignorance, of homophobia, and of racism. I've lost count of the number of women I know, or have heard of, who have basically decided to withdraw from cyberspace because of the terrifying levels of abuse that is directed at almost any female who puts her head above the online parapet. The firestorms of ersatz indignation that sometimes erupt on social media like Twitter hark back, if not to the Middle Ages, at least to the lynch mobs of the American Deep South. And if you want a taste of the astonishing levels of cruelty that people seem capable of in the online world, then I recommend spending a few evenings with John Ronson's latest book. The title is So You've Been Publicly Shamed. Act 3 of the great Internet story ends at this point. Act 4 runs from here to eternity, and what happens in it is up to us. Now, in saying that technologies are socially shaped, I don't mean to imply that the nature of these technologies is unimportant or irrelevant. On the contrary, it's as important as the social and economic forces that determine how it's used. And in this respect, digital technologies are particularly interesting because they have particular affordances which make them radically different from earlier general purpose technologies which have changed our world. What are these affordances? Well, here are a few. First, there are zero or near zero marginal costs. That means that when you've made the investment to create an information good, then rolling out additional goods or services based on that costs almost nothing. Each successive copy costs almost nothing. And that in turn means that once you've made the initial investment to create the good or service, then replication of it is basically costless. Secondly, there are network effects. The phenomenon whereby the value of a network increases exponentially with the number of users. This is why the basic strategy of all successful internet businesses has been get big fast. That way you can get to the point where really powerful network effects kick in, and where it's therefore correspondingly more difficult for new competitors to challenge. It's also why there probably won't be another Facebook. The network power bestowed by 1.4 billion users is just too great. Thirdly, there's a strange fact that wherever you look in cyberspace, you never see a normal distribution. Never. No bell curves. Instead, what you see are power law distributions, the ones in which a very small number of actors, sites, agents attract the vast majority of the interest, interaction, or trade, with everybody else scrabbling for business or attention in the so-called long tail. And then fourthly, there's the phenomenon of technological lock-in, the process by which a proprietary technical standard becomes the de facto standard for an entire industry. In the dim and distant past, which some of you may remember, when the computer really was the PC on your desk rather than the server in the cloud, Microsoft controlled 90 to 95% of that market. Which meant that if you wanted to make a living as a software developer, then you had to write software that ran under Windows. End of story. With the decline of the desktop machine, Microsoft's technological lock-in has eroded, though it's not yet dead, as a visit to any government, hospital or corporate office will confirm. Its successor is probably the APIs, the application programming interfaces for Amazon's cloud computing services, because they are now the ones you have to adhere to if you want to write software for cloud applications. These affordances, these four affordances are interesting because if you take them together, they appear to point in one direction, and that direction is towards winner-take-all scenarios. So what the affordances bestow on the companies that have mastered these technologies is an unprecedented kind of corporate power, a power that we've only just begun to appreciate. Which brings us neatly to the question posed a few years ago by Tim Wu, a law professor in Columbia. In his masterful book, The Master Switch, Tim recounted the history of the great communications technologies of the 20th century in the United States: the telephone, movies, broadcast radio, and TV. Tim shows that the early years of these communications technologies were accompanied by optimistic hopes or utopian dreams. Every new communications medium brought with it hopes that it would ameliorate the ills of society. Broadcast radio, for example, attracted an extraordinary faith in its potential as the benefactor, perhaps even a saviour of mankind. The urge to exploit the new medium stemmed from humanitarian as well as economic motives. Well before the internet, Wu writes, in a world without page downloads, even before commercial television, the same urge to tinker and to connect with others for the pure good of it gave birth to what we now call broadcasting, and practically defined the medium in its early years. In the magazines of the 1910s, you can feel the excitement of reaching strangers by radio, the connection with thousands, and the sheer wonder of the technology. What you don't hear is any expectation of cashing in. In the United States, where broadcasting began, people dreamed that it would reduce the distance between citizens and a remote federal government, that it would elevate the level of public and political discourse, and that it would lead to a cultured society. A man need merely light the filaments of his receiving set, wrote the Director of Research at the Radio Corporation of America in 1922, and the world's greatest artists will perform for him. Viewed against this background, the hopes and dreams of the early internet evangelists seem almost tame. But in the long view of history, Tim Wu discerned a pattern. New inventions led to a period of openness, excitement, and a feeling that nothing will ever be the same again. But the openness doesn't last. Closure is triggered by the arrival of one or more charismatic entrepreneurs at the point when the novelty of the new technology is beginning to wane, and consumers have developed a taste for quality, stability, predictability, and higher production values than are being delivered by the nascent industry. The newcomers, Wu said, succeed because they offer a better proposition. In telephony, for example, Theodore Vail of AT&T, who was the entrepreneur in question, offered a single network as opposed to the variety of non-intersecting phone systems then in existence, together with a guarantee that if you had a Bell phone, as it then was, if you had a Bell telephone, that when you picked it up, you would always get a dial tone. In radio, NBC offered better programming with professional actors, better script writing, and so on. In movies, the emerging moguls, faced with the creative chaos of the silent movie business, built vertical integrated chains which owned studios as well as cinemas, employed the stars, and delivered sound and later colour. In other words, a more attractive, uniform product. And consumers respond to these propositions, which leads to a positive feedback loop. The new entrepreneurs become more and more successful, their competitors fall away, and eventually the industry is effectively captured, either by a monopolist, as happened with telephony in the United States, or a cartel, which is a good way of describing Hollywood, the Hollywood movie system. And the most insidious thing is that this process of capture or closure doesn't involve any kind of authoritarian takeover. It comes, Wu says, not as a bitter pill, but as, quote, a sweet pill, as a tablet, easy to swallow, beloved. And in fact, most of the monopolists in history, or the cartels, which take over information industries, deliver a kind of golden age, deliver a process of unprecedented creativity of a certain kind, less diverse, but innovative still, frankly just a great product. That's the key, and that's what leads the markets towards closure, unquote. Now, you can see where this is headed. The big question, the existential question that now faces us, is whether this process of capture and closure described by Tim Wu will also happen to the internet. Because remember that it too started, all those years ago, as a technology that fostered utopian dreams. It was seen as a democratizing, benevolent force that would change societies for the better, that would enable us to build a more attractive, cosmopolitan, connected, sympathetic world. It still retains the potential to achieve all of these great things and more. But with every passing day, it diverges further from that uplifting path and heads into a virtual world of monopolistic shopping malls, passive consumption, and pervasive, intrusive surveillance. And the strange thing is that we could, if we wanted to, stop this rot that masquerades as technological and social progress. That's why the insight that technology is socially constructed is so important. The internet we have today was not just an inevitable working out of the logical implications of the technology, but the product of choices made by the interactions of technological innovation, capitalist exploitation, governmental paralysis, and user behavior. And this gives us a clue about what must be done if we are to take back the net from the institutions that have been relentlessly appropriating it for their own purposes. So what do we need to do? First of all, we, the users of the internet, have to change. We have for too long behaved like irresponsible, naive idiots, accepting grossly skewed terms and conditions and allowing ourselves to be turned into online consumers rather than active citizens of cyberspace. Many of the things that we tolerate in the virtual world, the kind of intensive surveillance practiced by the NSA and its overseas franchises, would be seen as unthinkable if they were replicated in the real physical world. Just imagine it. A policeman stationed outside the door of every home, checking on the movements of all its inhabitants, checking out their visitors, knowing every publication they read, being able to intercept every single communication they make. Unthinkable in the real world, and yet apparently tolerated by us in cyberspace. We tolerate similar abuses by the companies that provide us with the services we crave. And yet the strange thing is that they are terrified of us, because they know that without our clueless acceptance and passivity, their prosperity is threatened. They saw what happened in the online protest against SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, for example. So, by the way, did the members of the US Congress. And they have been deeply alarmed by the way the Snowden revelations have undermined public trust in their cloud computing services. So they're not invincible. They may look it, our governments may think they are, but they're not. And if you doubt the feasibility of frightening them into changing, just do this thought experiment. Imagine what would happen if every Facebook user were to boycott the service for a week, or if every web user were to use DuckDuckGo rather than Google as a search engine for a week. Just for a week. Imagine the calls from Wall Street analysts, the flight of advertisers, the plunge in share prices. Imagine the moguls of Sand Hill Road, the place where Silicon Valley's premier venture capitalists are based, suddenly having to change their underpants twice a day, as their surefire investment suddenly starts to waver. Because the old army phrase, shit scared, really means something. But we also need to wise up and act like citizens in the real world, as well as in cyberspace. Our governments have to be pressured to assert the public interest in the evolution of the online world, rather than passively accepting the dogma of technological determinism. As a start, the laws relating to data protection need to be radically updated to reflect our current reality. We need laws that ensure that all the personal information that results from our use of the technology belongs to us. All our metadata, our click streams, our location tracks, and the rest. And that this data can only be accessed, exploited, and processed by others under conditions of pellucid transparency. The hidden market in personal data, the huge hidden market in personal data, has to be outlawed or regulated. And finally, we should recognize that many of the flaws of the internet we've got are in fact a byproduct of the cloud computing architecture that has become the latest manifestation of the technology. It's important to realize that there's nothing inevitable about this. It just seemed the obvious thing for the companies to do at a particular moment in the evolution of the technology. Allowing them to keep all our data in the cloud may have been a good idea once, but it has already passed its use by date. We need a radically decentralized architecture, like the data box concept which has been developed by my colleagues in Cambridge. Technology that enables each one of us to have a personal cloud, which we control, and which interacts with corporate and government servers on conditions explicitly embodied in APIs that we have approved. There's lots more than one could say in this vein, but my time and your indulgence are limited. What I really wanted to say, that there is wisdom in the Rolling Stones song from which I took the title of this talk. You can't always get what you want, it says. But if you try sometimes, you find you get what you need. Okay, it's time we started trying. Thank you.